Sure.
All right. Hello, Lisa. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure. I always love to kick off the podcast with the question of how do you, Lisa, keep yourself well?
Wow, that's a great question. For years, I have been a big believer in exercise, diet, sleep, water, the basics. And then in times of adversity, it just becomes more and more apparent to me that those are the cornerstones of keeping my head above the water.
Hmm. Interesting you say that because I think that is often the time where it's most challenging for people to take care of the basics. And often too, when you're having trouble keeping your head above water is when you're caring for others or catering to, other demands. Have you struggled with that in the past, letting go of those things to kind of take care of others and maybe have had to learn the hard way? I know for me, I've had to learn that the hard way multiple times over, slow learner, stubborn.
I think that is honestly part of being female. I think it's within our genes that we will do anything and everything to care for our loved ones, and unfortunately that means taking care of ourselves goes to the bottom of the list a lot.
Mhm.
And when my kids were small, that's what Mama Bear did. Everyone else was taken care of and made happy and so on and so forth. And, by 11 p.m., Mama Bear didn't have any gas in the tank to do the things that I needed to do for myself. And I literally crashed and burned. I have a history of depression and anxiety, and it just kind of went deeper and deeper until I learned that I had to fill my bucket first.
I think so many can relate to having to crash and burn until getting to that point of, allowing. And my hope is through these types of conversations, we're constantly giving people, women, especially if they're listening as, mothers, the permission to put yourself first. And, of course, the air mask analogy from the plane, like, take care of your own oxygen first, but it's so much easier said than done. How do you, well, I guess you learned this, it sounds, after your kids were no longer young. What would you recommend women or people, individuals do when they find that guilt, like just this immense sense of guilt of trying to put yourself first? Because I think that's the biggest issue is it feels so much easier said than done.
Well, and to add on to that, I don't know that it's always just guilt. I think it's time constraints, right? There are busier seasons in our lives than others. And by the time the lunches are made and the kids go to dance and hockey and you spend time with your husband and, the house is cleaned and the groceries are bought, there isn't time
Right.
unless we make time. And I know for myself, you're right. It's easier said than done. And we run out of time and we've got really excuses. But I guess what I did was it was a check in for myself. And after you've crashed and burned a couple times, I know even how much better I feel to go out for a walk by myself for an hour, how much that will recharge my batteries. I know that I will be a better mother. I know that I will be a better partner, a better worker, and just a whole lot happier to be around when I have, I don't think we need hours and hours and hours of extensive time alone or investing in trainers. Those are great, don't get me wrong, but I think the key is just finding those things that help us fill our bucket. It might be a paint class, it might be a yoga class, it might be a walk with the neighbor, but identifying what it is that fills our bucket and then schedule it in, because if it's not scheduled, it's not happening.
Hmm. Well, and putting it, at a priority level that's equal to some of these things, Of course, like babies need fed and those things maybe have to take precedence. But, some of those other things where I'm like, maybe groceries can wait a day, and like it's actually better to pick up a rotisserie chicken or order in something that is still nourishing but quick, and you know, just knowing that it deserves to be a little bit higher up on the priority list. So what was your experience in kind of coming to this realization that something had to shift to prioritize yourself a little bit more? As you said, mental health being a part of it, crashing and burning, having to learn the hard way. How did this come full circle for you to be able to prioritize?
Frankly, I had no choice. I had stumbled along trying to do all the things and be all the things to all the people. And 8 years ago, we lost our daughter in a car accident. And I, being the control freak, recovering control freak that I am, I took it upon myself that I was going to be the one that got my husband and my son through this tragedy. I took 10 months off of work because I had buckets of sick time. And I dove headfirst into being everyone's everything. I did all the things. I cut the grass. I tried to make their lives as easy as possible because my son was going to school. He was 15. My husband decided that if we are going to make my son go back to school, then one of us should go back to work. He was back at work, and I wanted them so much to be okay. And in doing so, crashed and burned, and actually suffered in silence with suicidal ideation. Thankfully, um, out of left field, I can't even explain why that switch was turned off, but it was. But that was like a huge smack in the head. Okay, you need some help mentally. And I knew I had been working as a health coach for years prior to that. And I knew that my antidepressant, if you will, was being active and eating well. And I needed to start simply drinking enough water to replace the tears. Sounds ridiculously simple, but I wasn't drinking water. And, the science shows us that the more dehydrated we are, the more likely we are to feel depressed. So it was just a big, ugly time in my life. And I knew that I needed to make myself a priority.
I can only imagine the loss of a child, and that so many's, response to grief is control, right? Like how do you possibly manage this unfathomable loss? And I think that control is such a common coping mechanism, I can imagine. And I where does that leave space for you to grieve? How do you feel that affected just a postponing of the grief, of bottling up? And, once that did come to the surface, which sounds like it was kind of festering slowly, how did you begin to move through that?
The grief was there from the minute I had a police officer in the coroner in my front room. There's no doubt about it. But whenever I talk about grief, especially new grief, it's like a Six Flags roller coaster. Like it's moving so fast and so unpredictably, veering left, veering right, loop de loop. You don't know what's coming next. You don't know if you're going to want to puke, if you're going to want to scream, if you're going to want to yell that you want to get off. It's that harsh and that unpredictable. And that's what it was like. However, we had a 15-year-old son at the time. He's now 23, who did not choose healthy coping skills.
Mm.
And there were literally times in my own grief journey, even on that Six Flags ride, where I had to take my grief and put it over there for a bit and just focus on him. And it took, oh boy, 2 years until I would say that I could go to sleep without him being at home, knowing that he was making better decisions, knowing that he was safe. And I would say that's when I could actually literally feel myself take a breath. It took me that long. I was harboring so much fear. And I think when you lose someone you love who's so close to you, you realize how fragile life is. And I mean, Katie left the house on an ordinary Tuesday night to run an errand.
Mm.
She was killed in a head on collision, right? It's not like there were no drugs, there was no drinking, there was no texting. Road conditions were good, you know. And I just, for a long time, felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Something else terrible was going to happen. So I don't know that it's a really cut and dry answer that I can give you, but there's just so much going on, so many dynamics. And when you talk about grief, you could line 100 grieving mothers up in a room, and nobody's going to do it the same. We all come into grief with our own pre-existing life journeys, other traumas, um, religious beliefs, a variety of things that come into play when we are grieving. My husband and I, who agree on everything, parenting, money, I didn't think our marriage was going to last. At about the 6-month mark, he was a very quiet griever. He needed to be in his own space, even though he went to work every day. Don't know how he did it. He would come home, but I would literally get the hand if I started to talk about Katie or grief or what I was feeling. I was a doer. My grief was very active. I needed to have projects. I was creating scholarships. I was, doing dress drives for graduating grade 12 students who didn't have the funds to buy a fancy gown. I was doing all kinds of things. And that was not the way he wanted to grieve. Our son, as I said, was out in left field. He didn't have maybe the life skills as a 15-year-old boy. You don't have a lot of life skills. And so his go-to were anger, mad, and pot.
Mm.
Bad mixture, very bad mixture. And I was willing to do anything to help my son. My husband just put the blinders on, put his head in the sand.
Mm.
It was a really, really hard time. There was not a lot of Lisa time because I didn't allow it, right? I was on a mission. I was on a mission to help someone and save someone.
Mm. And I really appreciate the analogy that you use with the roller coaster, because I think for those who have been fortunate enough to not have to experience grief in that way, we hear, the stages of grief, and it's depression, anger, bargaining, acceptance. And it sounds like it should take this linear journey. And I think that's just so not the case very clearly. And, also, how long does it last? And I'm sure you can speak to it, never, it never goes away. You're never done grieving. It just looks different, and you grow around the grief.
Yeah. Yeah. Very well said. I mean, I say that I went from that awful Six Flags roller coaster to the kiddie roller coaster.
Mm.
So it's, the ups and the downs and the loop-de-loops and all of that aren't as so severe, but they're still there. Um, I've chosen to build a life around my grief. Unfortunately, there are people who don't want to do that in fear that they're leaving their person behind. I prefer to think of it as bringing my daughter with me. I
Oh.
just have to figure out how to do that, right? So, and I also think that grief is like this horrible, heavy boulder. And I've just got to figure out how to carry it because I can't put it over there. I can't put it down. Like it's with me. It's with me forever. So I just kind of have to figure out the way to move forward and carry it with me.
Well, and I mean, to the point, thinking about your son being 15, well, no 15-year-old, no mother, should ever have to have the tools to manage that type of grief. And it's, I think about counseling and therapy, and, I think we're having more and more conversations about health all the time, mental health, postpartum even. And maybe there are some tools that kind of proactively we can prepare with and pick up along the way, but no one's proactively preparing to deal with a loss like this. And how, how do you? And you shouldn't have to. So, how lucky your son is to have had a parent like you who could step up and show up for him. But I can't imagine the challenge in, navigating those various dynamics. So once you started struggling with your own mental health as well, what were the actions that you started to take? I mean, coming back to some of those foundational care habits, the basics, as you said, literally just hydrating, when I can imagine just breathing and showing up to life on any given day feels impossible when you're dealing with a loss like that. Once you recognize, like, okay, I'm really struggling, beyond what feels, sustainable, what did you move forward with to support you?
Well, the first thing I did was pick up the phone and called my counselor, who I had been seeing. However, while I was comfortable being open and vulnerable and honest with her, it took me 4 years to tell my husband that I had been struggling so deeply. He heard me practicing for a speech that I was giving on stage about 4 years after we lost Katie. And he walked past the room and he just backed up and he said, "What did you just say?" I said, "Yeah." I said, I was counting sleeping pills and staring down the wine rack, at about the 6-month mark. He had no idea. No idea. But honestly, like, you're 100% sure or certain, we cannot prepare for grief, right? Even if someone is actively dying, say in hospital, has received terminal illness, a diagnosis, there's a certain amount of preparation we can do for that. But the loss of a child, you don't prepare for that. But I think that's why the foundations of self-care are so important. And I think, like, for myself, because this was a part of my life and coping, because I did struggle with depression and anxiety to a certain degree before this happened, and knew and learned the hard way that exercise, diet, self-care, like just the basics were critical for me. So I think I lasted 8 days after her accident without exercising. And it was like I could hear her chirping away in my ear, just saying, "Mom, you're going to feel better. We have a home gym. Go downstairs and just do something. Just do something." And, that was the push that I needed. And then from there, I'm not a runner. I mean, it is just a terrible thing to watch me try and run, but we have a treadmill in the basement. I call it plodding. That's about what I do. But I ran on that treadmill every day for months until I couldn't walk. And, was basically pulling myself up the stairs with the banister, because I would get to that point, first of all, of exhaustion because I wasn't sleeping. I needed something to help me sleep. Even the sleeping pills didn't work. My knees hurt like hell, but it gave me that runner's high. If anybody has had that before, it gave me the belief that I could survive another day. And that's all I needed. One more day, one more day, one more day. And I just found my crutches and I found my tools as I went along, and then I went to a mom's grief group and I met some amazing women who were, 4 and 5 years further down the road. One said, "Oh my gosh, grief yoga has really helped me." Well, guess what I was trying the next day, right? Or journaling really helped me. Awesome. I was just so open to anything. And then I call it like a grief tool belt. So over time, if you're open to these things, you're building your tool belt. Because even without grief, I think we all know that not always is the same tool going to help us when we're struggling, right? Like, maybe sometimes it's calling a girlfriend. Maybe sometimes it's talking to your therapist, but maybe those things don't work sometimes. So the more tools you have in your tool belt, the more likely you are going to have something when you hit the rock bottom again.
Well, and to you, I was thinking the toolbox is the perfect analogy. And where you're when you're at different points on this coaster, like might have to try a few different tools and see what works in that day. And I mean, I love that you highlight these basics because, of course, I'm a health coach as well. I'm constantly like, sleep is the number one. Like, don't even worry so much about movement and nutrition if you're not sleeping, not that it's not all important, but like sleep, hydration, movement, nourishment, you know, you and I think both view these as the basics and the fundamentals, but a lot of people are not at the point yet in their journey when they're even where they're implementing those. And I think this is just another example of the importance of those things in life, whether you're a new mom, as you had spoken to, and, have to have that foundation, it builds resiliency for whatever you end up going through in life. And so if you at least have those that you can come back to, with if all you do that day is drink your water and like eat a nourishing meal, that can be a success, at that point. So I'm really thrilled to hear that you mentioned these resources. I think of course counseling comes to mind for people, but knowing that there are groups, you can connect with people who have gone through the same thing. You can find classes dedicated to this. Was therapy and counseling with your family a part of the healing process?
No, I tried to make that happen.
Mm.
Remember, I said earlier that I was a little bit of a control freak? I think within 2 weeks, I was dragging my son and husband to counseling because I thought we got to do this as a family. We got to figure this out. And unfortunately, we had a terrible, terrible counselor. And after 2 visits, both my son and husband on the way home from the session both said, "Why are you making us go?" And I could just tell that it was not for them. One thing I've learned is that, the old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but it's up to them. And my son, so he started going to counseling this summer. So at 7.5 years.
Oh,
Yeah, he had some other things happen in his life. And it just ripped the scab off of his grief, which he had never really dealt with. And he was the one that came to me. And this is where I am so inspired by the younger generation, because I think they are the ones that are going to make great changes in this world when it comes to mental health. Here's my young son who's 23 years old, tough guy, works in the trades, tears in his eyes, and said, "Mom, I think I need some help." I said, "I think you do too." And, I don't know if he's still going, but he's in a good place. And he recognized that he needed the help. But my husband has never gone after those 2 times, but he's good too. And our marriage, like, it was questionable at 6 months. We're great. We're
oh,
great. We grew apart initially, but we grew back together stronger.
I'm so glad. I mean, I'm just thrilled. And I think that is such a challenging thing to want to make sure everyone else is healthy and know that their path to, I don't even know if healing's the right word. Like, do you ever truly heal from something like this, or it just becomes manageable? I don't know what language you would use in that instance, but that everyone's path to getting through it is different. And if it's so different from yours and maybe seems, counterproductive or destructive at times, I can't imagine how difficult to, kind of honor their individual needs.
Well, and as a mom, right? My husband was a grown man, so I have, you do you. But my son, and seeing the unhealthy choices, and just knowing as an adult where that can lead was terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. I do believe that his guardian angel kicked his butt when needed, and gave him a shove here and there. But yeah, it was about 2.5 years of pure hell with him. And then he started to see things differently himself and probably inherit some of his stubbornness from his mother and needed to do that on his own,
Yeah.
figure it out on his own.
Yeah. Big
Yeah,
sister was on guard to make
I
sure.
think so. I
Oh,
think so.
so how do you feel, over 7 years later, your son is obviously, still affected by this, as I'm sure the entire
Mhm.
family is and forever will be, once you've experienced a trauma like that. Do you find, hearing about car accidents and the like loss of other people's children, does it still like hit you like a sack of bricks? Does that get easier and just moving through hearing of other trauma?
I don't know. That's a great question. I'd never been posed that before. I do work with grieving mothers. I'm a certified grief educator, and it's a fine line between being able to listen and be present for somebody's grief, especially new grief, but also not take it on.
Mm.
It's hard. I had to go for EMDR. If any of your listeners are familiar with that, about 2 years after we lost Katie, I could not handle hearing sirens. I mean, we didn't hear the sirens that night. I was not on scene that night, but for whatever reason, sirens just about turned me inside out. I would always have to take a mental check, like, where's my son? Is he in school? Where's my husband? Is he at work? And if they were not, if my husband was golfing or my son was with his friends, they would definitely be getting a text from me. Just heard a siren. Where are you? What are you doing? Are you okay? And thankfully, they both humored me. Yep, yep, just doing this, just with buddies, whatever. And then I work in healthcare. I work in cancer care, and we'd had a code blue. So somebody became unresponsive in the cancer clinic, and I mean, we're trained. It can happen. We're in a hospital setting, but typically we run an outpatient facility. It does not happen often. And I don't know how, but I dodged the bullet all these years and finally had my first code blue. And even though I wasn't at Katie's accident scene, the rush of doctors, the rush of first responders, the rush, like the room fills up with people so fast that it was as if I was experiencing her accident, even though I wasn't. And that put me off work for a little bit. I didn't know if I'd actually be able to go to work. And that's when a colleague of mine who does EMDR said, why don't you come see me? Let's give this a try.
Wow.
And she works regularly with first responders, firefighters, police officers, so on and so forth. And this is a lot of what they do with them, the work they do, and it it changed my trajectory for sure. I
Wow.
was able to kind of reformat in my brain somehow. I can't even explain how it works, but I did need extra help like that.
That's incredible. What an incredible resource to be recommended at a time like that. And I would like to pose the question, I think I'll use my personal experience. I'm currently a friend, dear friend has lost a parent, and I've been, how do I show up for this person? And how do I support someone in their grief? And then, don't want to recommend things for fear of overstepping. But in this sense, it sounds like that was an incredible recommendation that you maybe weren't asking for a recommendation, but you were willing and open to hear it. But I feel like that's just such sensitive territory. How do we support people through their grief? Do we recommend things? I've also heard people say, don't put the onus of responsibility on the griever. Don't say, let me know what I can do for you, because that's putting the weight on them. But what do we say? What do we do? Can you give recommendations, on how to support someone through their grief?
I think the recommendations I'll give are very broad, which is probably not what you're looking for, but because as a griever, we're so different. I was open. If someone said, gosh, my friend is going to this group, maybe you want to try it. Yep, give me the information. I want to check it out. But I also know and have met lots of people that are not that open. But I think just starting at the beginning of what to say and what not to say, I think the basics are, I'm so sorry. This is so unfair. Because when we start into the cliches, God needed another angel, everything happens for a reason. All of these things, they're quite hurtful, right? Like, if God needed another angel, why didn't he take your kid? Right? Um, I always appreciate people just being so honest. I think one of my best friends showed up white faced and just said, Lisa, I I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. And just gave me a huge hug. And in fact, our daughters had gone to school all the way from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. And she said, I will never talk about my daughter ever again because I know it will be hurtful for you to hear. And of course I said, my gosh, no, please. You know, it hurts me to know that my daughter won't get married, won't have children, you know, but at the same time, I'm happy for you. So just her being open and honest with, I don't know what to say, I just knew that everything that came out of her mouth after that point was just coming from such a sincere place. Um, unless someone has gone through that exact thing, it's best not to say, I know exactly what you're feeling, because I haven't lost a parent. I I can't know what that's like. And I say this to be funny. It's not funny, but a couple of weeks after we lost Katie, somebody that I know quite well said to me, "Oh, Lisa, oh, I know exactly what you're feeling." And I thought, "Oh my gosh, I've known you forever and I didn't know you lost a child." She goes, "No, no, our dog died last week."
I
And
knew
I
that's
just
what you
thought, "Oh, okay. Okay." You know, and I was speaking on stage a month or so ago. I don't know if you remember, here in Canada, there was a huge bus accident with a hockey team. This goes back to 2018. And half the team died at the scene, including coaches and so on, and half have survived. But of course, all of these young men have got scars, whether they're internal or external. And I was on stage with one of the young men that survived. And I said to him, we lost Katie before that bus accident. And I said, I felt when we got the news about your bus crash that I felt the pain of every single parent involved. But I said I would never say it to many people that way because I can't ever step into your shoes. You know, and here he was, one of the players. He lost 16 people in a heartbeat. So comparing our grief is just never a helpful thing. In terms of what we can do or not do, show up. Just show up and keep showing up. As I mentioned earlier, grief doesn't go away. I love it when people send me a note, especially on Katie's birthday or her, I call it her angel anniversary. When someone you know loses a loved one, open your phone, put it in your notes, that person's birthday and angel anniversary, and reach out always on those days, even if it's 8 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out. Hey, just thinking of you today. I know it's Katie's birthday and I know it's always a tough one. Um, so Katie was 17 when she died, and a lot of her friends looked to me for support. And their way of communicating was through text. So I would often get, you know, heart emoji, thinking of you, or, you know, LOL, just remembering a time that Katie dumped an entire beer in her purse, or, you know, something like that. And that was so touching for them to reach out to me in a way that felt good for them. But sharing stories, if you knew that person, it to reach out to their family, their friends, and just saying, I just remembered this time, or here's this photo I have of her. I don't know if you have this photo. We had our front driveway shoveled the entire winter. The first year, we didn't ask anybody. Our neighbors just did it.
That's
I
nice.
had a coworker show up with a bag of toilet paper, tissues, paper plates, and non-perishable food so that we didn't have to leave the house. Because going to the grocery store, I don't know why, for grieving people is really hard. So those are just a handful of thoughtful things that people can do.
Those are really great and actionable advice. And I mean, that's why I posed the question, because of course, every grieving person needs and wants a different approach. But I think those are generally, good, safe recommendations. And I can imagine that period of grief, in the, once kind of the dust has seemingly settled from the tragedy, and the food is no longer coming, and the drop-offs aren't happening, and the daily check-ins aren't happening, and eventually people are going back to work, but you're still just reeling with it in such a big way. I can imagine that transition being really difficult. I've heard many people talk about kind of after services and funerals or celebrations of life, like it's so busy up until then that you almost don't have time to really think about it or be sat alone with it in the same way that you do after that. So that transition period, did you feel that shift yourself? And is that when you got into kind of the productivity of kind of doing and taking on some of these volunteer initiatives yourself?
It's a really lonely time. Like I would say grief gets harder after the funeral,
Mm.
at least initially, because everybody rallies around you after the event and then up until the funeral. Like I'm embarrassed to say, before the funeral, I think, like my doorbell did not quit ringing and I was exhausted. I hadn't slept in days and would people just, I never said it to anyone, but to my husband, would people just leave us alone? But then the funeral comes and they do leave you alone, right? Because people have come, they've said their, given you their condolences and all of that kind of thing. But then everybody else's life keeps spinning, right? There's still hockey to go to and dance lessons and groceries to be bought, and everybody else's world is spinning as they should be. But ours has stopped. So I would say that is probably the most critical time,
Oh,
to send the text. You don't even have to go over there all the time, although that's really nice. But check in, just thinking about you.
yeah, that's
I
such a,
know a lot of grieving people hate the question, how are you? Because we a lot of us feel like, well, don't you know? Like it's really crappy. So I try as much as I can to either say, hey, I've been thinking about you, or, oh, it's so good to see you.
Mhm.
And you can almost see their shoulders drop because now they don't have to answer that question.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of just checking in, like because it is. What do you expect the answer to be? Like, it sucks. This is shitty. It's the worst
Yeah.
time of my life. Like, of course, and I want to also give people the opportunity, like, I'm happy to listen to that if that's how it feels and you want to say that's how it feels. I think like so often people are putting on, especially with, like you said, like the funeral and the people coming over, you're putting on this brave face, like you're hosting almost, which is so unfair that that's the way it is immediately after. So lengthening the support ongoing. I mean,
Yeah.
forever, when it's a tragic loss like this too of someone so young. And do you get tired of talking about grief? I feel like that's a self-indulgent question since here I am, having you on the podcast to talk about grief. But like I can imagine that it must get fatiguing, to talk about it and be in it, or is it healing and therapeutic? And, just what's your experience? Is it empowering
I,
to kind of take it into your own hands?
I won't ever get tired of talking about my daughter. And that's what I see it as is an opportunity to shine her light. Even though, we're not talking about her maybe specifically as a person here, but I also do like talking about it myself because I do want people to know that life can be good again, right? I mean, I've received some hate mail about this, but I truly, truly believe that with work and with, a lot of perspective work and mindset work and all of that kind of thing, that life can be good again. What I do struggle with, and I do find it's getting harder, is to sit with other people's grief,
Mm,
because it's impossible for me. First of all, I'm an empath by nature, but then, to know that pain of another grieving parent, in particular, child loss, um, it's really hard to be with that.
yeah, I can only imagine. And to almost maybe be viewed as the person who has some sort of answer or magic formula, having gone through it, and to say, "Hey, it can get better." I'm really, I guess I should say, my initial reaction when you say you've received some hate, to say things like that, like it can get, better and there's a life on the other side of grief, is shock. But then I come to like trying to be empathetic and explore that, investigate it, and I can imagine it's jealousy or resentment for someone who, hasn't gotten to that point. Or where do you feel like that type of feedback comes from? Because, imagining it's from a parent who's lost a child, it's hard for me to imagine them not, wanting that for someone or hoping that for themselves and others.
Well, I think that, grief is a journey, much less any other, really, like going over a mountain, climbing Mount Everest. Like there's lots of hard things in life, but I think that we have to take some ownership, as the griever, and that is not something that you say to somebody who's in early grief. And I think we all come into our grief journey with different life experiences. Hurt people hurt people. Sometimes people are coming in to losing a child, having experienced lots of other trauma that perhaps hasn't been dealt with yet, or from all kinds of situations, or sometimes it's just thoughts in that they received in their upbringing. Sometimes it's religious thoughts, sometimes it's a variety of things. And I think whether we're trying to lose weight, which I realize is an entirely different thing, or we're trying to cope with our grief, we have to want that to happen before it can happen, right? I can't just think about losing weight, right? I've got to do some of the things. I've got to watch what I'm eating. I've got to exercise more. I've got to have that mindset. I've got to have the belief that I can lose that weight. And really, coping with grief on a very simplistic level is not that much different, right? But it takes time. We have to get to that spot where we're ready to think, hmm, I wonder, I wonder if maybe there's a different way that my grief can look, right? And to be open to that kind of thing. So it was hard. Like I felt for a long time that I had to hold my truth inside, because I did get some hate mail and hate social media messages in the beginning. So then I was like, oh well, geez, I must be doing this all wrong. And like that was awful of me. I can't believe I made someone else upset. And then, as the 8 years have kind of rolled on, I've realized this is my truth. This is my belief. Not everybody will agree, right? Not everybody's going to agree that life can be good after you lose a child, a loved one. But I do, and now I'm just a little bit maybe pickier with who I share that thought with, and kind of take into account where they're at on their journey. I mean, you want to be hopeful, but you don't want to grief shame anyone.
Well, and I mean, I really appreciate you having this conversation here, where other people will hear you say that. And I mean, my hope is that it inspires anyone who might feel like there's nothing on the other side of that loss. I think that's such a bookmark experience. It's like before Katie's accident and after, I can imagine, not to project it. And, there was that
Mhm.
moment, obviously, where you thought about ending that chapter, and I can imagine so many people think about it. So for you to be able to speak on the fact that you wanted to almost close your own journey and now you've seen how much life has to offer, 7 years and beyond gives certain perspective. And so I know you had mentioned, kind of fatiguing on holding other people's grief. Is that part of what's inspired you to, pursue more professional public speaking? And I know you've got a new podcast, which I'd love to know about. And I love the name Rising Strong, which is it's got good energy behind it. Tell me about your professional changes that have been happening.
I think whenever hard things happen to us, I think there's opportunity in there, and opportunity for growth being the main thing. And I'm a lifelong learner. And I mentioned earlier that I work in healthcare. One of the many hats I wear. I'm a radiation therapist, so I give radiation treatments to cancer patients. And taking that schooling and doing the work that I do, there's a lot of people that I give treatments to that are at end of life or in palliative care. I thought I knew a thing or two about grief. I really did. A large degree of my schooling, we talked about this stuff, but it always went back to the 5 stages of grief, which I actually have training from David Kessler, who is one of the co-authors and co-creators of that. I don't love that theory, but so I went on to become a certified grief educator because I wanted to learn more. I wanted to learn more about grief. I wanted to learn more about helping other people. I wanted to learn all of that. But I, more than anything, love to share the message of hope, because I think in this world that we're living in right now, with everything that's going on and unfolding and has been for years, we could all use a little bit more hope. I think that the message of human connection is also something that I'm very, very passionate about. We were never meant to do any of this alone. None of us, whether it's grief, divorce, any of these life challenges, or living, we weren't meant to do it alone. So that's really where my passion lies, and I'm just always open to the universe, just kind of guiding me along, or Katie, guiding me along to the next thing.
I love that. I mean, it just comes back to that it takes a village, which I think we often think about with like raising children, not necessarily grieving children and just grief. And how do you deal with the thought or, voice of someone's like, it's just not fair? That is just the thing that comes to mind. Like, yeah, it's just not fair. How do you get past just being stuck on that lack of fairness? As you said, why not someone else's? And not that you'd wish that, why not someone else's child, but like, how do you cope with that thought, which I can imagine can be a bit intrusive, the lack of fairness of losing a child or losing anyone for that matter?
100%. When I was taking my training with David Kessler, I think it was the very first day, he had us all do a group exercise, and we broke into small groups. And now I'll probably get the details of this slightly wrong, but I believe he asked everybody to list the top 3 things that were the best things that have ever happened in their life. It's typical, met my husband, got married, had children, whatever. And then the next thing were, what were the top 3 worst things that ever happened to you? And then after this exercise, everybody from each table got up and, as a spokesperson, said, at this table we had, it was unbelievable, Kalli, the stuff that was coming up. Like, somebody lost half their family in a fire. Um, there was a huge accident, like this bus crash I was talking about, and just horrible things. And it just, at first I thought, what are you doing? Like, this is a depressing enough topic enough to learn about grief, but now we're highlighting everybody's tragedies. But the whole point was that he was trying to make us realize is that, unfortunately, part of being human is that we're all going to have some things in our lives, and they're frankly, are worse things. Like, even in my situation, I have come to believe there are worse things than what I've been through.
Wow.
Missing children, people who have gone missing. Mom doesn't know where they are. Maybe they've gone into, found their way into trafficking somehow. Um, Murder, rape. I mean,
Yeah.
and to now have that perspective is very powerful for me. Also, working in oncology taught me a thing or two. Um, in the first while, I too was that person saying, this is so unfair. Katie was smart. She was going to be a nurse. She was going to be a real bright light. She was going to do good things in this world. Like, why my kid? I only got her for 17 and a half years. And then I took a step back and reflected on all the families that I've met at the cancer clinic, seeing them there, a lot of them by the bedside of their child. I know that there's lots of families who don't get 17 and a half years with their kids. So I have changed the way I see that. I got 17 and a half years with my girl.
What a
But
beautiful.
that is something that takes time to arrive at.
Yeah. Oh, that's really beautiful perspective. Well, and I think, it's difficult to be in a room highlighting everyone's tragedies. I think if we could walk around and see a little sign over everyone's head, outlining some of the hard stuff they've been through, we'd show up for people with a different level of kindness than we do day to day, like that. Everybody's going through something. Wow, if we knew, right? So just,
And to add to that, which is absolutely correct, I think to know that other people are going through hard things makes us feel less lonely or less unfair, right? Because you start taking a look around and you think, holy moly, like that family's dealing with their son's addiction. That family's dealing with, maybe dad's infidelity. I don't know. But we all have things, but we all put on, like our Instagram filters and date night with my husband. And so I think our perception is that everyone else has this better life, this better scenario, this better situation. They don't know my pain. Well, they may not, but I'm quite certain they've got their own pain.
yeah. Oh, that's such beautiful perspective. And I appreciate you sharing. And I think, I'm learning so much from this conversation about grief. And to me, it just looks like there's maybe not in my head, I always say DABDA, the denial, anger, bargaining.
Mhm.
This is from Psych 101. I've had this
Yep.
and that acronym has never left me, but, I
Yeah.
think just viewing it almost as like chunks or chapters where like you're ready to hear different things and have different perspective, like, and that could be months for some people, years for other people. It's just so personalized. And I know you mentioned a few beautiful highlights about Katie, but I would love for you just to tell us a little bit more about her if you're willing, because of course she hasn't been, detailed in this conversation, but you're here and doing so much incredible work, helping so many people. And I would love to be able to have a testament to her and get to know her a little bit more.
Oh, that is just one of my favorite things to talk about.
Hey.
I could go on for a long time, but in a nutshell, she was sassy. She was spicy. She was a firecracker. There was no arguing with her. We always told her she should have been a lawyer. She could rant like nobody's business, argue with anyone, anywhere, anytime about anything, and win. Um, she was a diva. She was a fashionista. Even though I always say, like she wasn't a drinker, she wasn't a partier, but I say that she had a serious addiction to Sephora makeup.
Oh,
I
that's
mean, this goes back 8 years ago, but my husband actually took her bank card away one time because she spent $500 in one shopping spree. And this was a girl who worked as a hostess one day a week, so did not have a big bank account.
oh, I love it.
And just a funny story about makeup. the boyfriend that she was dating when she passed away was actually the son of one of the doctors I work with. And he had been in a serious car accident about a year before, and as a result, had debilitating headaches. And so they were meant to go out one evening, and he canceled at the last minute. And she comes out of her room just steaming mad. And she said, well, doesn't he know I have $75 worth of makeup on? And just one other funny story. So, same boyfriend, his car wasn't working well. And she had just gotten off work. She was sitting in my front window eating like French fries, like fast food out of a container. And his car hadn't been working. So his dad said, well, take my car. So he pulls into the driveway and she looks out the window and she's like, oh, great. He brought the Porsche. Now I can't eat my French fries in the car. Just out of the mouths of babe.
To be
Yeah.
in the mind of a
Anyway, she was
17-year-old girl.
fun. She was fun and feisty. And man, I miss her every single day.
Oh, thank you. I feel honored to have this conversation and even get to hear about her and the beauty of being able to turn something so tragic and unfortunate into something where you've clearly impacted so many people, myself now being one of them. I just appreciate you so much. And before you go, I really would love to hear a little bit about your podcast.
Yeah. Well, it kind of came about actually when my son first started expressing his mental health struggles in the summer. And, just being honest with my own mental health struggles over the years. And I just thought, I would really like to do a podcast that's more focused on mental health rather than grief specifically. So I started Rising Strong Mental Health and Resilience October, November. And it's really almost like conversations like this, where I bring people on who've been through really tough things. It's not all grief. In fact, I'm not sure that I've had anybody on just grief specific, but um, all kinds of things. And I just, so we highlight the tragedy in the beginning, how they move forward, because I think that's so important. And then we really end on the hope and the resilience and the mindset at the end at the end of the interviews. And it's something that I'm really, really, really loving.
Oh, I'm really excited about that. I mean, and again, to give that perspective, I think that those stories will be so helpful to so many. And I really appreciate you sharing with me because I've learned so much and I want to be mindful of your time, but I have a few quick rapid fire questions
Sure.
before we go. So I always like to ask, who is your biggest role model, biggest inspiration, if you have one?
Oh boy. I would have to say off the top of my head, Brene Brown.
Ooh, do you want to know? She gets mentioned just two podcasts ago, maybe, but always like, yes, love her for good reason. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you
Yeah.
have a favorite Brene Brown like book talk? Because she has some good TED Talks or excerpts that you're a fan of.
Honestly, I love them all. I think the Netflix video that she has out right now, and of course the name is escaping me,
Oh,
but I just love everything that comes out of her mouth.
okay, good one. Amazing. Thank you. Best advice you've ever received?
Mm, I think that was before I got married, and it was the minister who married us, and he said it comes down to this: put your partner first.
Mm.
If you do that, he says you'll always be solid.
Wow. I wonder if that advice got you through that 6 month hump. That's great advice.
Possibly.
Best book or resource you'd recommend?
For grief
Any
or for life?
two, let's do two.
Oh,
I'd love for one for
okay. Let's
each
do
if
two.
you've got favorites.
Well, I will give a little plug for my own book then. If anybody has lost a child, I do have a book. It's called Journey to Healing: A Mother's Guide to Navigating Child Loss. And I weave in, it's not just my story. It's actually, Katie is a part of that, but I've woven in the journeys of 32 other grieving mothers and just the solid self care pieces that I talked about today. And let's see. Oh my goodness, you put me on the spot here. I can't think of another one right now.
Well, I mean, yours is perfect. And thank you for bringing it up, because in your list of accomplishments, I can't believe you forgot to talk about your book. So thank you. And we'll link it. And that sounds like a truly incredible resource. And last but not least for questions, personal mantra or words you live by.
I can do hard things.
Ooh, good one. Who's that? Glennon Doyle. Well,
I think so.
I'm sure someone else said it somewhere before her, but I think she gets
Right.
credit to it. And last but not least, for people who want to follow along with you, what you've got going on, your resources, where can they find you?
Probably just follow me on Instagram for right now. That's Rising Strong Podcast.
Perfect. And like I said, we'll link it, your episode and your resources on my website. And I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to be here, share with me, and share with the listeners. I am grateful to move forward with some of your advice.
Well, thank you so much.